Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for tuning into this solo episode, which is the sequel to the previous solo episode that I released. That was the bulking FAQs episode. So this time, as you might imagine, or as you already know, because you can see the title of this episode, this is going to be the cutting FAQs episode. So without further ado, let's get into the first question. How long can I keep cutting for? Most people don't take cutting phases to the extremes of a bodybuilder in contest prep, so there's no physiological reason that I'm aware of to stop a cut in most cases. In theory, you could keep going until you achieve your ultimate leanness goal. But in practice, the following are psychological and practical constraints that I would invite you to consider. The first one is diet fatigue, and I've described this concept at length in many other resources, with one of them being episode 53, Why You Stop Sticking to Your Diet and What to Do About It. That's episode 53. So, in this episode, I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of my definition of diet fatigue, which is the following. Diet fatigue is a combination of physiological and psychological symptoms that accumulate the longer you diet for and or the more aggressive your deficit and or the more fat you lose. And these symptoms include hunger, mood swings, sleep disturbances, a loss of motivation to diet, physical fatigue, and stress. And when you hit your personal diet fatigue threshold, your fat loss phase no longer feels like an empowering choice. It becomes a slog, to the point where you're struggling more and more to maintain your consistency and to enjoy the process. This is usually a good time to take a break from your deficit for at least 1 week. However, the greater the diet fatigue, the longer you may need before you feel ready to tackle a deficit again. The second consideration to make is metabolic adaptation, which is another concept I've talked about a lot in other podcasts. And one of them was an interview with Dr. Eric Trexler, who has a lot of knowledge on this topic. And this was episode 106, Fat Loss Metabolism, all about metabolic adaptation and metabolic damage. Again, it's episode 106. In short, metabolic adaptation is a collection of physiological signs that your body is becoming more efficient at burning calories in an attempt to stop you from losing any more fat. Like diet fatigue, metabolic adaptation increases with diet duration, deficit size, and the amount of body fat lost. And at some point, your body can become so metabolically adapted to your current deficit that you're going to encounter a fat loss plateau. And the solution here is to diet harder. You need to either eat fewer calories or do more activity. I don't know why I said either or. There's actually a third option, which is a combination of both. In some cases, however, you may not be comfortable with lowering your calories any further, and you may not have the time or ability to do more activity than you're already doing. Unfortunately, increasing the size of the deficit is the only way to bust a plateau that's derived from metabolic adaptation. So what do you do? Once again, taking a break from the deficit is a reasonable choice in an attempt to achieve one of two outcomes. Outcome A, you reverse the metabolic adaptation to such an extent that you can go back to dieting at the previous intensity, meaning the same calories and amount of activity that led to the plateau. But this time you won't be plateauing again for at least some time, because again, the metabolic adaptation has been reversed to an extent. And the only way to reverse metabolic adaptation is to get out of a deficit and stay at maintenance calories for a while. Outcome B, you recover enough from your current degree of diet fatigue that even if your metabolic adaptation hasn't reversed much, you're at least mentally ready to take the calorie cut and or to take the increase in activity that you previously decided against. The third consideration is personal preference. There's no fastest dieter award, as I like to tell my clients. So if you're sick of staying in a deficit, you have a holiday coming up, or you just want to put the diet on hold for a bit, you can increase your calories to maintenance at any point during your fat loss phase, and you can practice holding your new lower body weight for as long as you want before you dive into another fat loss phase. Question number 2. Should I cut calories and or increase activity as soon as I hit a plateau? The short answer is no, but before I give you the long answer, let's start with my definition of a plateau. It's a period of at least 2 weeks in a row where there hasn't been any change on the scale in your measurements, in your pictures, and in the way your clothes fit. Importantly, if you have a menstrual cycle, during PMS, your weight may go up and your body may get more bloated than usual. This isn't fat gain if you've been on top of your diet and your activity targets. This is due to hormonal and fluid changes. However, these changes can skew your pictures, your measurements, and your scale weight, and they may make you think that you've plateaued or that you are regaining lost fat, when neither may be true. So in this case, you want to wait until you're over this menstrual cycle phase. Apologies, I stumbled over my words. You want to wait until you're over this menstrual cycle phase and then reassess your data to check whether you've actually hit a plateau or whether it was simply menstrual cycle related. If you have indeed plateaued, here is my step-by-step process to address it. Step 1, do a food tracking audit. Because in many cases, the problem isn't that your calorie target isn't working anymore, it's that you're not tracking calories as consistently and accurately as you were at the beginning of the diet. The good news is, you don't need to lower your calories if that's the case. You just need to go back to weighing food and logging it as religiously as you did when you were seeing progress. And I have a comprehensive guide to tracking calories and macros as consistently and accurately as needed in order to get results. And that's a relatively recent podcast, and it's episode 167 or 167, a masterclass in calorie and macro tracking, episode 167. Step 2, do a step and cardio audit. Before you make any changes, you need to make sure that you're actually consistent with the targets you originally set. So if you realize that you've been slacking with the steps and or with your cardio, you want to start hitting them properly to see if this increase in activity makes the difference that you need to see things start moving in the desired direction again. Step 3, reduce calorie intake and or increase expenditure. If you're on top of A and B, then yes, it's time to either lower your caloric intake or increase your expenditure, or a combination of both, in order to bust the plateau. And in many cases, even a relatively small change can yield results. For example, you may not need to slash 300 calories and add 90 minutes of cardio in order to bust a plateau. In fact, I am pretty confident you won't need to do that. Instead, what I would do is go from, say that you're eating 1600 calories per day, I would go down to 1500. I would keep all other variables the same. I like to change just one variable at a time and then watch what happens in the next week before you make another change. Now, if you have a deadline or you're really keen to get things moving ASAP so that you don't lose motivation, you can make a bigger change. The trade-off is that the bigger the change you make, the more challenging the diet gets right away. Whereas with more moderate changes, the challenge builds up more gradually over time. I should also say, before I move on to question 3, the 3 steps I've outlined are most appropriate in a context where no other variable has changed relative to before you hit a plateau. I'm going to give you some examples to make this clearer. If you got sick, that's likely why you plateaued. You were not sick the entire time you were on the diet. Now you got sick. That's likely why you're seeing differences on the scale, or rather, you're not seeing differences on the scale in your measurements and in your pictures. Depending on how intense this bout of sickness is, you may also not be able to do your usual training and steps and stick to your diet as per usual. So what I would do is wait until you're over this sickness. Sometimes the illness isn't so bad, and in that case, you could still make changes and proceed with the 3 steps I've outlined in order to bust your plateau. For example, if you just have a bit of a drippy nose and you're not losing fat, well, the plateau probably isn't down to your drippy nose. Another example would be if you're undergoing a major life change, such as a change of job or a house move. Again, this is likely to compromise your ability to do your steps, your cardio, and stick to your diet, but also the increase in stress that you can get might result in a plateau on the scale because of the increase in water retention, or at least a slowdown in the rate of fat loss. At this point, my main concern would be, is it realistic to try to stick with a calorie deficit, which is quite challenging, when you're undergoing such a big lifestyle change, essentially? And in some cases it may be, and in some cases it may not be. But these are 2 practical examples of when the 3 steps may not always be appropriate to follow, simply because the circumstances are very different from the way they were when you were dieting and seeing good results. Now, moving into question number 3. Is my weight loss too slow or too fast? And I'll start with my rule of thumb, which is that for most people, dieting for longer than 8 weeks, aiming to lose an average of 0.5 to 1% of their body weight per week, most weeks, not every week, tends to maximize fat loss and muscle retention. For people who are severely overweight or have obesity, losing 1 to 2% of their body weight per week, so a little bit faster, is also usually safe, because even though this requires a pretty steep calorie deficit, these people have plenty of energy stored in the form of body fat that's going to prevent them from losing excess muscle mass. If you aren't overweight or have obesity, you could still lose 1 to 2% of your body weight per week while minimizing muscle loss, but only if you take the right approach to training, which is beyond the scope of this episode, and if you only maintain such a steep deficit for a short period of time, usually less than 8 weeks. Having said that, we also have a meta-analysis and meta-regression that I'm going to link in the show notes, suggesting that a deficit greater than 500 calories per day may blunt muscle growth and even cause muscle mass loss in people who regularly lift weights. 500 calories per day would yield a loss of about a pound per week, which is obviously less than 1% of body weight for a lot of people. So the results of this paper may seem to contradict the ranges that I've mentioned above, but context here is key. The leaner and more well-trained you are, the less body fat you have to protect you from muscle loss, and the harder it is for you to build more muscle tissue. So in this situation, yes, likely keeping your deficit to 500 calories or less is going to be the safest option for you. Whereas, as stated previously, if you have obesity, you may be absolutely fine in 1,000-calorie deficit. And not only that, if you're also newer to resistance training and you have obesity, you have double the reasons not to worry so much about being in over a 500 calorie deficit, or rather in a deficit larger than 500 calories per day, despite the results of this paper. And if you want to delve into the nuances of how fat loss can impact muscle growth and muscle retention, I strongly encourage you to check out another podcast interview with Dr. Eric Trexler, which was episode 116 or 116. How fat loss impacts muscle growth. And this is again episode 116. If you take all these considerations together, and if we also include practical and psychological factors that are going to affect fat loss, in my view, your best dieting speed is a compromise between three considerations. You don't want to lose so slowly that you lose motivation. You don't want to lose so fast that you drop in a lot of muscle mass. And you want to target an amount of calories and physical activity that you can be consistent with for a prolonged period of time. For example, some people lose motivation if they don't see a 1 pound loss on the scale every single week. But they also don't have the dieting experience and resilience to be consistent with the caloric target, steps, and cardio required to lose this much body weight every week. So they keep trying and failing to stick with the diets, and they end up starting over Monday every Monday. In this case, the best compromise, in my opinion, is to adjust your expectations regarding fat loss speed and to focus on targets that you can actually achieve. Because, ironically, this will make you lose fat faster than you're losing now, because you're going to stop starting over every week and you're going to begin getting consistent results for a longer period of time. And in my experience as a coach, the sweet spot for those clients of mine who are dieting for longer than 8 weeks is usually a daily deficit of about 300 to 400 calories below maintenance, because it's not steep enough to lose muscle or to make fat loss particularly challenging, but it's fast enough to see consistent results and to stay motivated while also being able to navigate life, work, family, hobbies, and holidays. Question number 4. How many calories should I eat? And there are 2 common ways to work out your deficit target. Number 1, you can work out your deficit as a percentage of your total calories. And that's a common method in a lot of research, whereby the researchers may set their subject's deficit as, for example, 20% of their original maintenance intake. In this case, as a rule of thumb, 10 to 30% is considered a small to moderate deficit, whereas 30 to 40% is a pretty large and challenging deficit. The second method is relative to your desired rate of fat loss, or ROL. And this is my preferred method because it relies on one of the primary metrics that we can use to assess progress, and that's the amount of scale weight loss over a certain period of time. And in order to make this calculation, I refer to this common heuristic, whereby a pound of body fat is roughly equivalent to 3,500 calories. So if you want to lose a pound in a week, you need to create a deficit that equates to 3,500 calories below your maintenance calories across the week. You divide that by 7, that's 500 calories. So your daily deficit needs to be 500 calories below maintenance. And you can achieve this deficit by decreasing caloric intake and or increasing energy expenditure. And for best results in terms of not only fat loss, but also health and overall body composition that has to do with muscle retention and growth, not just fat loss, I recommend a combination of both a decreased caloric intake and more energy expenditure. I also usually recommend aiming for a target caloric range as opposed to a single number, whereby your top end of the range would be the biggest deficit that you can sustain realistically, and also, as I said, without losing a ton of muscle mass. So let's say that that's 500 calories per day. And then at the bottom end of the range, you've got the smallest deficit that makes the most sense when life gets hard, or there are other reasons why you can stick to the greater deficit. And in this case, that might be 300 calories. So you might end up setting a daily deficit of 3 to 500 calories per day. And then on any particular day, you choose which end of the range is more appropriate for you. But on average, every week, you want to be within this target range. Now let's move on to question number 5. What should my macros look like? And I'm going to cover protein, fats, carbs, and fiber. So let's start with protein. My usual recommended range in order to maximize muscle growth or at least retention in a deficit is to aim for 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. If you're overweight or have obesity, using your current weight is going to yield a result that's way more protein than you actually need. So instead, use your goal weight or a weight that corresponds to the normal BMI category for your size. For people in a deficit, I specifically recommend aiming for the higher end of this range, so 2 grams plus, or even slightly above, which is based on a study that again will be linked in the show notes, that I covered in an interview with one of the authors, Dr. Eric Helms. And this interview was episode 141 or 141. How much protein should you eat in a deficit? So I strongly encourage you to check that out for a deeper dive into this particular topic. Anyway, there's a caveat here. We don't just want to eat as much protein as you can possibly fit into your calories, because if you're eating so much that you don't have enough calories left for fruit, vegetables, fiber, carbs, and fats, then take your protein consumption down a notch, because it is important, but you need other nutrients as well. On the other hand, if you struggle to eat enough protein and there's no way you can get to this higher end of 2 grams plus or above, then focus on eating as much protein as you can while staying in a deficit. Moving on to fats. Depending on which of these two methods to set your fat target is more realistic relative to your caloric intake, you can set dietary fats as either a minimum of 20% of your current caloric intake per day, or a minimum of 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.3 grams per pound per day. As for carbs, you want to set carbs as the remaining calories after working out protein and fats. And as I mentioned in the bulking FAQs episode, if at all possible, it would be great to aim for a minimum of 3 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per day in order to support resistance training performance. However, when your calories get a little low in a deficit, these may no longer be realistic, in which case you want to aim for as many carbs as you have the calories for when you're hitting your minimum fats and protein. Finally, I want to touch on fiber, because eating enough fiber is always beneficial, but it becomes especially important in a fat loss phase, because the speed of your digestion tends to slow down, and you can also get a little bit constipated, as this is part of the metabolic adaptation process. And in this case, this is one of the rare cases when I will give a blanket recommendation, because I find that 25 to 35 grams per day as a weekly average is very effective for most people to maintain good bowel health, whether it's during a diet or at maintenance calories. There's also the more personalized recommendation, which is to consume 14 grams of fiber for every 1,000 calories consumed. This works really well when you're at least at maintenance calories, because it roughly equates to 25 to 35 grams per day. That's where this blanket recommendation actually comes from. But in a deficit, 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories consumed can be less than 25 grams if your calories are low enough. And that's why in this particular case, I think the blanket recommendation may be more effective than the more personalized recommendation, because in my experience, the closer you can get to 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day in a deficit, the better your gut is likely going to fare. Question number 6. How do I stay fuller for longer? I've covered this particular topic in a lot of different resources, and I have three that I want to mention to you today. One is an article titled A Comprehensive Guide to Feeling Fuller on Your Weight Loss Diet, and I'm going to link that one in the show notes. The other one is a podcast titled How to Manage Hunger on a Fat Loss Diet. It's a two-part episode, and the first part is episode 45 or 45. The final resource is an interview with Calvin Scheller, the evidence-based approach to managing your appetite, and this was episode 138 or 138. So check these out for the longer version of the answer to this question. Here I'm going to give you the TLDR version of my hunger management tips. Some hunger during a deficit is to be expected. Embrace it as a good sign that you're most likely in a deficit. Eat at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Eat at least 25 grams of fiber per day. Eat high volume foods like fruit, vegetables, lean protein, and unprocessed or less processed carbohydrates. Look up the satiety index list and pick foods that score high for satiety, like white potatoes, which in this particular study won the crown for the most satiating food. Eat more volume, protein, and fiber at the time of day when you tend to be hungriest. Eat slowly and chew thoroughly. Choose crunchier food textures because some research has shown that these are more satiating than creamier textures. Keep your meals similar day to day in order to reduce the amount of time you spend thinking about new recipes and playing macro Tetris on MyFitnessPal, because these can increase psychological hunger and food focus. Make your meals tasty enough to enjoy them, but not so tasty that it's all that you think about all day. And it helps, in these regards, not to overdo zero-calorie sauces and syrups. Avoid drinking your calories, but do consider zero-calorie soda, which can help with sugar cravings, and it can also help making you feel a bit more full sometimes. Get enough good quality sleep and manage your stress as well as you can to lower the chances of stress eating. Learn to pause before giving into a craving or before you comfort or stress eat, because this gives you time to think through your choice. It may not be enough to overcome the urge to eat, and you may still choose to eat, but it's a great first step. And last but not least, probably my favorite tip is stay busy. It makes a massive difference. Question number 7. Should I eat back the calories burned via exercise? Now, don't shoot the messenger, but the answer is no, because most gym machines and fitness trackers like Fitbit provide vastly inaccurate estimations of your caloric expenditure. So by eating those calories back, you risk staying at maintenance calories or, in some cases, even put yourself in a surplus for that day. Question number 8. Should I take a refeed day? You can, but you don't have to. So let's define what a refeed day is. A refeed is a bodybuilding term referring to a high-calorie day, or a higher calorie day than your typical deficit. Sometimes this higher calorie day is accounted for within your daily deficit. For example, if you're aiming for 1500 calories per day, and you take a refeed at 2000 calories on one day, you're going to remove 500 calories from other days so that your average weekly intake still averages out as 1500 calories per day. Other times, you choose not to make up for the higher calorie day for the specific purpose of slowing down your rate of fat loss that week, so that your average calories for the week are going to be a little higher than your typical target. So using the 2000 calorie day example, if you were to hit 1500 calories on the other 6 days, your weekly average intake would be 1571 calories per day instead of straight up 1500 calories. Outside of bodybuilding contest prep, most people don't need to slow down their rate of loss for physiological reasons, but you can still choose not to make up for a single higher calorie day for other reasons. For example, if this higher calorie day was the result of an uncontrolled overeating episode, so in other words, the refeed happened to you, you didn't choose it, then making up for it can feel like punishment. And in that case, simply going back to your routine is likely a better option. And as a side note, I'd argue that if you find yourself frequently losing control around food and overeating in a deficit, you'd probably be better off returning to maintenance calories and addressing why you lose control and you overeat and mend your relationship with food before you jump back into a diet. In a bodybuilding context, when bodybuilders take a refeed, usually the increase in calories comes primarily from carbohydrates in order to fill up glycogen stores, improve training performance for at least one day, reduce diet fatigue slightly, and sometimes trial a peaking strategy for the day of the competition. But if you're in a lifestyle fat loss phase, like all of my clients, I'd still recommend aiming to increase primarily carbohydrates because you can still fill up glycogen store and improve performance for at least the day of the refeed or the day after, but you're probably not dieting to such extremes that you're going to see a major difference either way, whether you choose to increase calories primarily via carbs or whether you also increase protein and potentially dietary fats a little bit. When it comes to dietary fats, however, I would not increase them beyond 1.5 grams of dietary fat per kilogram of body mass per day. And I believe that a sweet spot range to aim for would be between 0.5 and 1 gram of dietary fat per kilogram of body mass per day. Question number 9. What's the difference between a refeed and a diet break? First, I'm going to start with a note on language. Diet break is the most common term in research and in the fitness industry, so I still use it for ease of understanding, but I prefer the phrase deficit break, which I actually learned from my colleague Brandon Da Cruz, with whom I've had plenty of interviews, so I'm sure you're familiar. Anyway, a refeed is usually limited to 1 to 3 days, whereas a deficit break lasts a week or longer. And the biggest difference is that a longer deficit break is going to reduce diet fatigue and metabolic adaptation to a much greater extent, although this depends on the actual duration of the deficit break. Whereas a 1 to 3 day refeed is going to have more of a short term psychological or practical benefit. For instance, if you wanted to have a higher calorie birthday weekend, you'd use a refeed. But I wouldn't expect these 3 day refeed over the weekend to resolve the diet fatigue or the metabolic adaptation that you might have accumulated if you've been dieting for 5 months straight. At that point, you definitely need a longer deficit break. Question number 10. How many steps should I do? And for general health, I would recommend at least 8,000 steps per day based on the research I'm aware of. For fat loss, my clients and I usually see the best return on investment when you're aiming for at least 10 to 12,000 steps per day, because this is enough steps to increase the rate of fat loss to a meaningful degree, but not so much that it becomes a practical burden on your schedule. Question number 11. How much cardio should I do? I would recommend as much as you can fit into your schedule without compromising your ability to resistance train at least 2 to 3 days per week, which is important to at least maintain muscle, and without getting to the point where you're exercising so much in a deficit that you're not recovering and now you're not seeing progressive overload for this reason and not for other reasons like you're now so lean that the best you can hope for is maintain muscle. However, I wouldn't be too worried about exercising too much because most people don't exercise enough. So I'm really not concerned that you're going to train yourself into the ground. And in general, the range that seems to work best for the majority of my clients is about 30 to 90 minutes per week. Split into however many session works for you, although I would suggest at least 20 minutes per cardio session. And this is when discussing specifically moderate intensity cardio. For HIIT, it would be shorter sessions than 30 to 90 minutes per week, if we're talking about actual HIIT, which is what I teach my clients to perform, as opposed to more of a circuit style training that's not actually as intense as true HIIT can be, in which case you can go for longer. Having said that, there are also some people that already get the cardiovascular benefits they need and want simply for walking and lifting, so they choose to do no extra cardio. And the last time I tested my cardiovascular fitness a couple of months ago, this proved the case for me. Question number 12. Is fasted cardio more effective than fed cardio? Meaning, is it better for fat loss if you don't eat before doing your cardio and you do it first thing in the morning? My suggestion is pick the cardio modality and timing based on what you can stick to. So if fasted cardio works better for you, then yes, it's going to be more effective than scheduling it for later in the day. Otherwise, the research I'm aware of doesn't seem to show a meaningful difference between doing cardio in the fed state versus the fasted state for the purpose of fat loss, at least in the average person who isn't already very lean and trying to get even leaner, such as for a photo shoot or bodybuilding purposes. And that's the people that I work with. So these are the outcomes I care about. Question number 13, and this is going to be the last one. How do I track progress? I'm going to list the methods that I typically use. You don't have to use all of them, but I would pick at least 2 of them and be consistent with them. Because if either or both of the 2 methods you pick show a change every 1 to 2 weeks, then you know you're going in the right direction. The first method is scale weight. I recommend weighing yourself 3 to 7 days per week, fasted, after going to the bathroom if you have to. If you don't worry about it, and before you drink or eat anything, which is the same as saying fasted, but I just wanted to spell it out. Then you want to take your weekly average weight and compare this week to week. And if you have a menstrual cycle, you ignore the weight spike that can occur during PMS. The second method is to take physique pictures once a week. I would take them without flexing, front, back, and side, and also while flexing. So you would strike front double biceps and back double biceps. And if you don't know what these look like, they're the super common bodybuilding poses that everybody knows. Just Google it and you'll see what I mean. The third method is to take body measurements, no more than once a week. And I would take chest, biceps, abdomen, waist, lower abdomen, hips, and thighs. And the final method would be to choose a fat loss phase outfit, so to speak, a pair of bottoms and a top that you try on periodically from the beginning to the end of the diet, no more than once a week, in order to check if this outfit fits more loosely over time. And to finish off, I have 2 resources on how to interpret specifically scale weight to both assess progress and tweak your plan as needed. And one is an article titled How to Track Your Weight for Muscle Gain or Fat Loss, and it's going to be linked in the show notes. And the second one is a podcast episode, How to Use the Scale as a Tool for Fat Loss and Muscle Gain. That's episode 30. And that's a wrap for this FAQs mini-series that I recorded. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you want to work with me, the link to my application form is in the show notes. If you can leave a rating or a review, that would be amazing. Obviously, I want a 5-star rating or review because why not? Obviously, my podcast is amazing. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.